All right. Hi, guys. Nice to see you all. So tonight's class is going to be very intensive. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and I think you guys are going to have a much better perspective of, first of all, where these sites are. You know, you read about them in the Bible, in the historical text, but it doesn't give you an idea as to where these stories actually took place. So what we get to do tonight is we're going to see where these events took place, and we're going to see how that plays into the larger archaeological context, not only within the land of Canaan, but also within the land that is specifically designated as for being part of the Amorites. All right, I'm going to go back to the PDF file, and that's where we're going to be most of the evening, is with the PDF. And as you can see, I've gone a little bit more high-tech than what we've been in the past. So I didn't make it through the entire, I had originally said through page 533. I only made it through page 528 because there's just so much information. I didn't want this to end up being a 2-hour class tonight. So what we'll do, we'll just catch it the next time around. So let me go to the very first portion that we're going to cover is this idea of birthright. And we're going to see how that plays into the overall blessings that are given to ancient Israel. So what we find is that in Genesis 48:21, that Jacob gives the Joseph tribes, that would be Manasseh and Ephraim, he gives them an extra portion. This is what Jacob says to them. And Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I die, but God shall be with you and bring you again into the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow." So the idea that what Jacob is giving to the Joseph tribes is that they're going to have to war for this land. If they're going to conquer this one extra portion above his brothers, they're going to have to take it with sword and with a bow, so there will be warfare that will be involved. The other idea that we find is this idea of the land of the Amorites being specifically given to the children of Israel. And this is given as early as the time of Abraham, which would have been roughly as early as 1875. It could have been even earlier than that God gives this to Abraham. And this is the promise that is given to Abraham. It says, in the 4th generation, they will come here again. In other words, here again to the land of Canaan. But God is waiting because the sins of the Amorites had not yet come to their fullness when God had given Abraham the promised land covenant. So you find that God has to wait. He says in Genesis 15, verse 17, that it will be 430 years or 400 years, and then in the 4th generation. So that's usually understood to be 430 years. So here again, we see the idea that the land specifically belonging to Amorites is ceded to the children of Abraham through Isaac. Now, the other idea that we find associated with this is the idea of birthright. And I put some definitions on this one because I wanted you guys to be very firm in understanding what a biblical birthright is. So a biblical birthright is a right, privilege, or possession to which a person is entitled by birth. A biblical birthright entitled the eldest son to a double portion of land, and that is usually termed primogeniture. Primogeniture existed well into the Anglican English era. If you guys are familiar with the Jane Austen novels, one of the things that she criticized in England and much of the parts of Europe is how when a male owner of land died, it never really went to the women. They were really kind of, women and daughters were cast out onto the streets. So in her novels, she really showed this plight of how women never inherited land and they were never taken care of. Now, in Bible times, if you want to go back 2,500 years, in Torah, that was not the case, because in Torah, a woman could inherit land when her husband died. And there were a lot of different safety mechanisms put in place to protect the woman from that sort of injustice and that sort of inheritance where women were just kind of shifted from estate to estate, never having anything that was rightfully their own. Now, this is one of the texts in Deuteronomy that governs the right of inheritance. And let's go ahead and read this. This is Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 through 17. It says, if a man have two wives, one that is loved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn be heirs of that which was hated, then it shall be when he makes his sons to inherit, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn above the sons that were hated, which was indeed the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion for all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Now, let's put this in perspective with Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. Reuben would have been the rightful firstborn, even though Leah would have been the one that was hated and Rachel was the one that was loved. Now, if you're familiar with scripture, you know that Reuben did not inherit. So the question often that arises is, did Jacob follow this statute when bequeathing the inheritances? And the answer is yes, he did. And this is the reason why. It's when biblical blessings are given. A biblical blessing usually has both a birthright, which is land ownership, as well as a blessing, which is right to some sort of rulership or monarchy within a territory. What you find where the 12 tribes are concerned is that Reuben, the firstborn, disqualified himself by committing a crime. So if you look at Noah, when Canaan or perhaps Ham, it's kind of ambiguous in the text, but when you read Genesis 9, either Canaan or his father did something that was very egregious enough for Noah to remove the birthright from Canaan and to give a double portion to Shem. So Shem has that double portion. Shem passes it down about 150 years before he dies to Avraham. Avraham inherits it, and he goes to claim his birthright within the land of Canaan. So this birthright passes down from Avraham to Isaac and then to the 12. Reuben disqualifies himself by sleeping with Jacob's concubine, something that was forbidden in the law. So he loses the birthright and the blessing. The next are two boys that were very, they got into a lot of trouble together. That would be Simeon and Levi. These were the two brothers that when their sister was raped or was compromised in some way, they went in and slaughtered all the men of Shechem. And this was something that caused Jacob an enormous amount of grief. He feared for his safety, for that of his entire family. They had to pick up and move away from Shechem so that they could have safety. What the brothers did was totally unjust. Jacob actually, if you read through Genesis 49, you find that Jacob actually gives them sort of a curse instead of a blessing. And I do cover that in chapter 4, if you're interested to go back and looking at that. So the first son of Leah is Judah. So in Genesis 49, it states, right around verse 9 and 10, it says that Judah prevailed above his brethren, and to him, it's right, it fell. So Judah actually inherits the birthright and the blessing. And this is why we find that the rulership for the entire house of Israel descends through Judah and not through the other tribes. Now, there's a caveat with this rivalry between the Rachel tribes and the Leah tribes. And that is the fact that Joseph was the actual, even though he wasn't the firstborn, he was the one that was hated of his brethren. So the fact of how he was treated, the hatred, the injustice that was done there does indeed entitle him to a portion, as well as the fact that the true firstborn of Leah had somewhat disqualified himself. But what's interesting is that Jacob does not take that double inheritance out of Judah's rightful portion. Rather, Jacob increases it. He multiplies it by giving the Joseph tribes one extra portion on the other side of Jordan, in which is today modern Jordan, but back then it would have been the ancient Amorite territory. So Jacob gives this extra portion to the Joseph tribes and gives Joseph the same rights of a firstborn as he does Judah, with the exception of family leadership, which always stays within Judah. So the next thing that we have, I put together this little map. The map itself just came off of the internet. Hold on just a second. Ariel, would you make sure the dogs are put up, please? Thank you. And here I wanted to highlight the Amorite territory. Now, I think you guys can see. I'm going to move this over so I can see. I think you guys can see my mouse. I hope you can. If not, okay, yeah, there it is. So this over here to the right of the Jordan River, where you see Bashan, the Amorites, this is where Og would have been. And here you have the Amorite Shihon. So you had the two Amorite kings. And notice that their territory bordered on the territory of Ammon. The Ammon, again, is a descendant of Lot. And that's where they established their territory. Now, technically, even though these are Amorite territories, much of the interior of Canaan also had Amorite leanings. You know, they were very mixed. If you look here in the south, if you can see my mouse moving around, this right here would have been an Amorite territory. So what we're going to focus on today and in today's class is we're going to look at the archaeology for this area right in here, this area opposite Jordan, that is going to be called the Jordan Disk. And the archaeology of this territory is absolutely amazing with how it conforms to the story of the Exodus, and how they, if it's an accurate story in scripture, then we should naturally find a correlating story within the archaeological stratum of the various sites that are excavated in this territory. So who were the Amorites? I just wanted to give you guys a brief overview, because Scripture's view of the Amorites does depart a little bit from the Egyptian view, or even from the modern scholarly view. So kind of you find that different people at different points in time had a different view of who the Amorites were. So let's go just review this real quick. From about 1800 to 1500 BCE, the world recognized the Amorites as a West Semitic speaking language. Hebrew or Ivrit would have been one of the languages that would have been used by West Semitics. Canaanite would have been a West Semitic language. Phoenician, a very, a cousin to this language as well. But the Egyptians called all of these people Asiatics or Amu. Scholars who look at the Hyksos era, when they look at those who came into the Delta region from Canaan, they always identify these people as Amorites. Forget the fact that these Amorites could have included the Pazarites, the Havites, the Girgasites. All of these people are usually included, at least in scholarly discussions, under the general label Amorites. And the reason for this is that when it comes to Egyptian inscriptions, or when it comes to archaeological excavations, we don't have any neon lights flashing that says, hey, we are Hivites, and this was our home. You know, people don't leave anything that really identifies themselves in the soil. So it's something that we are left to reconstruct when these sites are excavated. So for the purposes of our discussion here today, just be aware that the Amorites are a very general categorization, both within the framework of ancient Egypt, as well as within modern scholarly treatments of that evidence. Now, the Amorites were indeed part of the Hyksos who invaded Egypt. They usurped the Delta region from about 1800 until they were expelled in 1500. And they showed some affinity with Assyria. There was an inscription that was found in one of the wells at Alvarez, which would have been the Hyksos capital. And that inscription showed ties. It was written by one of the regents within the court of King Hammurabi. So there was some sort of affinity between the Hyksos and Assyria. We really don't have enough evidence to really say how close that relationship was, or if they were maybe a kindred tribe at that point in time. Now, Isaiah does make a very interesting statement. He says, "My people went aforetime to Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause." According to Isaiah, it very well may be that the people we are today calling Amorites may have had some ties to Assyria rather, while they were in Egypt. So just keep that in mind as you review the evidence. So what we're focusing on today is this idea of this one extra portion above that Jacob gives to the Joseph tribes. And the conquest of the Amorites is very interesting. And scripture actually contains quite a bit of information that allows us to be very particular. So when Israel comes into the promised land, this would have been right around 1508 BCE. We're given a very specific designation of what Israel found. Shabbat Shalom, Stephen. So glad you could make it tonight. All right, so the conquest of the Amorites, this is what it says. It says, "So YHWH our God delivered to our hands Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him till none was left to remaining. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the king of Og and Bashan. All these cities were fenced with high walls, gates, and bars, beside the unwalled towns, great and many. And we utterly destroyed them, as we did it to the king Shihon, king of Heshbon. And we utterly destroyed the men, women, and children of every city." So we find some interesting facts within this text. At the time of Israel's exodus, they destroyed over 60 cities. 60 of them were high-walled with gates and bars, but we also find that there were a lot of smaller towns that were unwalled that Israel also conquered. Now, the reason you have so much controversy, and the reason you have so much strong voices against the historicity of Israel's conquest of Canaan is because scholars are looking at 1250 BCE for Israel's conquest of this territory. When we come to 1250 BCE, there's nothing in this region. 100 years earlier, 1350 BC, there's still nothing in this region. It has been decimated, destroyed long before. 1450 BCE, it still shows signs that this area was totally decimated and it had been destroyed previously. But when we look at this account and we look at Israel's chronology as well as the archaeology, something interesting emerges that although it goes against the modern dating of the Exodus, it does support a biblical dating of the time of the Exodus. So this picture is a photo of the Jordan disc, and it's a little grainy. It might be kind of hard to see. But what you have here, you have Mount Nebo in the back. This is where Moses would have stood on Mount Nebo. He would have looked over this entire plain into Jordan. I'm sorry, this would have been the town of Jericho here in the forefront. This is what Moses would have seen. Remember, the text states that right around Deuteronomy 33 that Moses looked across the plain with undimmed eyes. You have Ammon in the background, Tel El Haman, which is a site we're going to discuss in a moment, as well as the plains of Moab. The covenant of Deuteronomy, it states that it was contracted, that God contracted that covenant, and it was the very last day of Moses's life. And it was within a month of Israel entering the promised land that God contracted the entire Deuteronomy covenant on the plains of Moab. So Israel would have been somewhere in this general vicinity. They would have already have decimated and conquered Tel El Haman. And this whole area would have been at peace before them. They would have faced no adversary and no armies or any forces whatsoever coming at them from this direction whenever they come over the Jordan. Now, remember also in the story of the spies hiding in Jericho, remember how YHWH states that they had heard what they had done to all the cities of the Amorites. Well, if they had destroyed 60 cities, you can guarantee that there would be some rumors going around about this incredible army that totally took out all the Amorites in their cities. Now, again, I mentioned last week that one of the criticisms of the biblical text is that at 1250 BCE, none of the towns that are mentioned in scripture have walls. They don't have fortifications. They don't have gates. They're very open cities. They're not well protected. But when we come to the 1500s, we're talking somewhere between 1550 BCE and 1500 BCE, we find that all of these sites throughout the Jordan Disk area that we're looking at tonight, as well as within Canaan, they're all heavily fortified. Now, this is Tel El Haman. We're going to look at this in detail. And I just wanted to go over some of the excavation reports. I know this can be kind of boring, but it's really in these reports that form scholarly opinion. And understanding what the scholarly consensus is helps us to form an educated opinion and to make sure that our opinions conform with the facts. So I'm just going to go ahead and read to you what the scholarly consensus is. Now, you'll see that I have two dates, 2015 at the top and 2010. Tel El Haman is very well funded. It's one of the few excavation sites that has gifted us with detailed excavation reports where the archaeologists that dig there are really on top of things and they really keep everything up to date. So these reports are 5 years apart, and I'm going to begin with the latest season first. In 2015, it says, one of the more surprising discoveries confirmed through season 10 was that of an early Bronze Age city wall extending not just around the lower Tel as originally thought, but also around the entire base of the upper Tel as well. Equally surprising was the fact that the Middle Bronze Age city fortifications were not confined to the mud brick earthen rampart ringing the upper Tel, but also extended around the lower Tel, following the line of the early Bronze Age intermediate Bronze Age city wall, integrating the older wall into the Middle Bronze Age defensive architecture. So what this is basically saying, I'm glad it's not boring for you, Cindy. What this is basically saying is that in the early era, you had where the city began building these massive walls. Now, the early Bronze Age era could have been anywhere between 2000 and 1800 BCE. But what this city does is it begins building these massive walls. At first, it's only on this upper city, and then you discover that they expand it to the lower city as well. This is the same type of fortification system that we see at Hatzor, where there's an upper city and a lower city. Same thing at Jericho. There's an upper city as well as a lower. And the idea here is that, you know, an army were to invade one and breach one of the gates, they may not be able to breach both of the walls. In 2010, and we're going to go back 5 years, in the excavation of the early Bronze Age city wall, we also unearthed a gate. It was 1.3 meters wide, straight through the passage, through which both the early Bronze Age 2 and early Bronze Age 3 phases then subsequently blocked. The data through season 10 of excavation support the existence of a general late Bronze Age occupational gap. And what this means is that the city of Tel El Haman existed until right around 1550, 1500 BCE. This late Bronze Age gap occurred from about 1500 through about through about 1400 BCE. It says, with the exception of a modest, short-lived, singular late Bronze Age 2A structure excavated in 2015, which was a likely way station in our Tariff house. So what is fascinating when you look at the evidence for this entire region of this Amorite territory that is specifically mentioned for Moses and the children of Israel to have attacked. And this would have been like a year before they entered Canaan. When they attacked all these cities and they did all of this campaigning throughout the Amorite territory, you find that the archaeology totally fits it. We found, let me go back. When we go here, we find that they were sit with walls and high gates. And what do we find? I know I'm going fast here. We find that in the excavation report that there are gates as well as tall walls. Now, this is the rampart and the city wall of Tel El Haman. It's kind of difficult to see. It's kind of small. I don't know if you can blow this up or not. But here's the early Bronze Age city wall. And here are the ramparts. As you can tell, they are quite thick. And you can tell that they've been expanded in subsequent areas. So again, this is the city that is building up its fortifications. It is anticipating some sort of eventual aggression where the city is attacked. So therefore, it is fortifying against that eventual attack. Now, this is what the scholars imagine the city walls and the gate to have looked like shortly before the conquest. Now, what is fascinating, you know, we read that in the conquest of Jericho, that there was a massive earthquake that accompanied after the Levites marched around the city 7 times for 7 days. All of these cities on this Jordan Disc area that we saw above, that are just right on the edge, every single one of these show a very large earthquake. Now, that large earthquake is actually dated about 100 years before the city's actual destruction. So whether or not there is some correlation between them is kind of speculative, because at this point in time, it is dated to an earlier period. But what it does establish is that there was a fault line and that this area was very prone to earthquakes at this point in time. Now, the other thing that we find is this idea of this territory encompassing more than just a city, but a city-state. Now, a city differs from a city-state in that a city-state is always highly fortified, and it is going to control and protect smaller cities. Your smaller cities may not be walled. They could be little villages strewn throughout the area. There could be several hundred of these little villages that fall underneath the protection of the larger city-state. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this. The complex Bronze Age fortification at Tel El Haman include outer and inner city walls and mud brick earthen ramparts, which are reminiscent of some of the Bronze Age urban centers in Mesopotamia. So again, remember earlier we mentioned how the Amorites showed some affinity with the Assyrians. It's very possible with the fall of Ur only about 150, 200 years before, that a lot of these are immigrants from Ur that are now settling in just east of the Jordan. Continuing with the slide, it says, all indicators seem to support that Tel El Haman was both large and fortified during the Igmatic period and surrounded by smaller intermediate Bronze Age sites, such as Tel Iqtanu in close proximity, for which a city-state interpretation is not out of the question. All of these cities were fenced. Again, this is from Deuteronomy. I'm just reiterating this point. They were fenced with high walls, gates, and bars. Besides the unwalled towns, a great many, and we utterly destroyed them. So when you look at what the biblical text actually states with what archaeologists conclude regarding the archaeological evidence for this particular city-states of Tel El Haman, it really fits this point in time. And this specific point in time we are referring to right now is going to be from about 1550 BCE to about 1500 BCE. Now, this is quite a few of the excavation reports have this conclusion that is stated in this slide. Now, let me just state that when you look at other sites within Jordan, and Jordan keeps a very tight wrap on all of its excavation sites. Some of them are very poorly funded. Some of them haven't even been excavated since 1967. So there is really a dearth of scholarship, a dearth of research done at many of these sites. So some of these we're going off of information that is really 30, 40 years old. But what the consensus tends to be is that every single site within the Jordan Valley was destroyed without reason right around 1550, 1500 BCE. And there is this occupational hiatus. Now, an occupational hiatus is just a fancy term, means that nobody lived there for about 800 years. You don't find any really structures or any pottery or epigraphic that would be written evidence at Tel El Haman or some of these other sites until as late as the Persian period. You find that in some cases, the kings of Israel might have had like a little garrison at one particular spot, but it was always very small. They were never re-inhabited or recommissioned for any reason, simply because they were at a place that was not favorable. It didn't benefit anyone in Egypt. It didn't benefit anyone in Turkey. And it really didn't even benefit anyone in Israel, other than the fact that it gave them a place to live. And the reason for that is that it was not on a trade route, so it really had no wealth to offer anyone in the world. And just to reiterate, I kind of jumped ahead of myself. When we are looking for candidates for the conquest, the one thing that I find kind of ironic, you know, scholars are just very outspoken about the conquest and who did and who did not, and why there is no evidence. But it's funny because when we do find evidence for this massive conquest across Canaan, you find that there's no reason for this area to be attacked. And scholars are unsurprisingly comfortable with the fact that there's no evidence and no likely candidate for causing this swath of destruction of well over 200 cities, or at least 200 known cities throughout Canaan, as well as into the Jordan Disk region. There's no explanation. We have no records of it from really any invading army, and just no reason for anyone to have attacked this region. And these are the three strongest reasons. Number one, it lay outside favorable trade routes. Number two, there was no military advantage. They really didn't have large populations. They were pretty small populations. And three, no economic advantage. It wasn't as though you were going to go in and collect tariffs off of trade from these regions, because no trade really passed through there. They were really territories that just lived, and they were self-sufficient. If they were going to trade, it was going to be, you know, going into Jordan or further to the north. So the other issue that comes when we are talking about the time of the Exodus and dating the Exodus I'm getting a quick drink of water here, is the reference to Goshen and Sharhuim. And I've mentioned this in the past. When we look at Sharhuim, Sharhuim was sieged by Amose right around somewhere 1530, 1500 BCE. And at some point in time, it was destroyed in that time period. It was never rebuilt. It again had an occupational hiatus of 800 years where nothing was built there, there was no activity, no one lived there. It really was not a significant place. It was really just an old abandoned heath. So when we look at this territory, Avaraz right here would have been the city where Israel was enslaved. When we looked at the Exodus, remember this Tel El Nakusta, we found that there was evidence of pastoralist and that the people had left there in great flight. They had actually dropped very precious gems, very precious much of jewelry on the ground in their flight out of the nation. Now, this right here is the land of Goshen. And what we find is that this territory of Goshen extended all the way up, which we're going to see in a minute, north into the Negev. And let me, I'm going to actually go forward one. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll look at the other map in a minute where it shows Sharhuim. But Goshen and Sharhuim would have been very closely linked as far as territory and as far as administration under the Hyksos. So this territory of Goshen is something that we will see God actually gives to Joshua with the conquest. So this is what scripture states regarding the conquest and regarding Joshua taking the land of Goshen. It says, and Joshua took Gaza with her towns and her villages unto the river of Egypt and the great sea and the border thereof, and in the mountains Shamir and Yatur and Sukkah and Danah. I'm not going to go through all those names. But then if you drop down to the bolded part, it says, and Goshen and Holon and Gilo, even 11 cities with their villages. So what you find is that the land of Goshen was a territory that was like a city-state, and it also had, like Gilhan, it had cities with villages. What's interesting, what I find interesting in this text is that God gives Israel basically the land which they dwelt while they were in Egypt. Now I'm going to go back to this slide. It's really debated where Israel's border would be. This branch of the Nile right here is called the Pelusic branch. It has since silted up. It no longer exists. It is totally dry. But it is this branch right here that appears, Israel's border may have been right here on the eastern side of this branch. So from a historical standpoint, what I find fascinating is that God actually kind of gives Israel the land in which they were oppressed, or the land in which they sojourned while they were in captivity in Egypt. Now, Simeon's territory actually absorbed the area of Sharhuim. And this is what scripture says regarding Simeon's territory. It talks about lots falling, and it says that Simeon's territory was within the inheritance of the children of Judah. And if you'll go back, I believe it's to Joshua 8, and I posted something on my wall on Facebook if you guys want to scroll back about 5 or 6 days, where when Jacob bequeaths and gives the blessings, and he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So what you find in Genesis 49, I think it's right around verse 5, you find that Simeon's territory falls within Judah. So Simeon is divided in Judah, and then you find Levi is divided among the entire 12 tribes of Israel, and he has no inheritance. His inheritance, he's given small cities within each of the tribes' territories, and Levi provides the service of government for all the nations, for all the tribes of Israel. But what's fascinating with this is we find that within Judah's territory, and then smaller within Simeon's territory, which is within Judah's territory, you find that Sharhuim which controlled or protected 13 cities and their villages, was part of this city-state in the south. Now, this one, okay, this is a picture of Sharhuan in this lower right-hand corner. You can tell that it's pretty large. You can also see where there is this wadi, this river that comes through. Now, in ancient times, the Mediterranean was about 15 feet higher than what it is today. And you actually had canals cut all the way through this territory where ships could actually sail into the city port and reach Sharhuan. And by doing this, it made the city very wealthy, very well protected, and it really gained a lot from trade with the Middle East. What we find here, let me go to the next one here. Okay, I'm going to go back in a minute. With Sharhuan, again, remember we saw that Goshen was right here, and then right over here is Sharhuan, right at the border of Canaan. So with Israel's borders, it's very possible it included the Sinai and all the way to Jaro, to that now silted up and defaulted Pelusic branch of the Nile. Sharhuan would have been here with its 13 cities and territories. So we're going to go back a moment. The vast destruction along the Levant. So this is a paper that was written regarding many of the Middle Bronze Age sites that we find that are just destroyed right around 1500 BCE. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this. It says, destruction dating to the late Middle Bronze Age, that's about 1550 to 1500 BCE. Whatever was the case, do not seem to have been limited to the Hyksos stronghold, as it is noticeable from the archaeological evidence. Conflagrations have been documented in the excavation reports of about 20 cities in southern Levant. So what we're talking about is just in the south, you know, of Israel, the Negev. There are at least 20 other cities that show destruction at the same time. So how do you account for this? Scholars offer not one theory as to why this occurred. Some scholars will venture to say, well, when the Egyptians you know, expelled the Hyksos, they went on this rampage and they conquered Canaan under Mose. The problem with that theory is that you find that it took Mose 3 to 5 years just to conquer Sharhuan. So, and what the destruction shows, when you look from the Negev in the south all the way up to the Euphrates River, because that's where you find the swath of destruction, that whole entire territory could not have been captured in 5 to 7 years. And that's what archaeology shows, is that this massive wave of destruction took place within about a 5 to 7, at most 10-year period, for which scholars really have no likely scenarios to account for this destruction. So again, we see Sharhuan, and then we're going to look at, this is the Tel Sharhuan, just kind of from a bird's eye view if you're standing on the ground. The next place we're going to look at is the epigraphic evidence for what we have for Sharhuan. So by the time that we get to Ramses III, and this would have been the Ramses that comes into Canaan, that conquers Canaan and expands Egypt's borders, you find that he talks about the cities, the major cities, having already been destroyed by the Hyksos. And it's very well, both he and his former pharaoh sister Hatshepsut, you find that they both acknowledge that there had been this incredible destruction reaped by the Hyksos at this time period, and they blame everything on the Hyksos. Now, biblically speaking, the Hyksos would have been a mixed multitude. Some of them would have been Israelites that left Egypt. Others would have been Amorites and other peoples that joined with Israel when they left Egypt. So it would have been a mixed multitude. But the point here being that by 1479, all the destruction that we see in the Levant, as well as throughout Canaan and the Jordan Disk, had already occurred. Now, the other thing that we find, and I am now on, for those of you that are following along on the book, I did not put page numbers on these. I may edit this and upload it. I'm now on page 523, at the bottom of page 523. The other thing that you find that is unexplainable by archaeologists is this sudden shift in equid burials. Now, equids refer to both horses, donkeys, mules. All of those would be equestrian type burials. And what you find in previous eras is that whether we look at Mesopotamia or Greece, you had always used horses or equines to as gifts for the gods. You would bury them in foundation deposits when you built a new city. You would offer them as sacrifices. You would slit their throats and use them to make covenants, so that they were very much a part of a sacrificial and ritual custom along the ancient Near East. But what is fascinating is right around 1550, 1500 BCE, these burials stop suddenly and drastically. And this is very important because anytime you have a shift in population, you have a new culture coming into an area, that is where you see a shift in burial practices, a shift in practices of offerings, foundation deposits, all of this. So what this is telling us, the record in the dirt, so to speak, is telling us that something has changed. The people that lived here before are either A, still living here, and they've changed their customs from the north of Syria to the south of Levant. All of a sudden they've changed their practices, or B, they no longer live there. Maybe they've been driven out and a new people has come into the territory and they have taken over, and they are now living where this former population had once lived. Now, one other thing to draw your attention to, when scholars look at Alvarez in Egypt, the number one thing that they are able to use, the number one technique that they can always identify a Hyksos burial or a Hyksos occupation, where they term it an Amorite occupation within the Delta, is because they will have these equid burials within Egypt. This is something we don't find. It's not an Egyptian practice. It is an Amorite practice. And so where you see this in Egypt, you know that there are Amorites. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this. This is by a scholar by the name of Paula Wapnish. She is really kind of pioneered the study of equine in an ancient Near Eastern context. And her work has really kind of revolutionized how we understand horses and donkeys and that sort of thing in the ancient world. So this is what she says. The survey of equid burials shows that the ritual inhumation of donkeys was a region-wide phenomenon. While these incidences of the practice in Greece are the most distinctive, close attention to the specifics show there are no attributions that are regionally distinct. An interesting question that remains is why, given its ubiquity in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia, the phenomenon did not continue. So what we find is there is really just this abrupt end to this cultural custom. And it really doesn't end just in Canaan. It ends in Greece and it ends in Mesopotamia, where all of a sudden equids are no longer used for rituals. And it's interesting to know or to consider what part Israel and their influence on the region may have had. And I bring this up because in Torah, it specifically banned equine as acceptable sacrifices. In Leviticus 11, verse 2, it forbid them from being even eaten within Israel. So all of a sudden, you have societies where they would have eaten horses or donkeys, perhaps on a regular basis or semi-regular basis. All of a sudden, that is now censured. And then you find that not only is it censured, you can't even use it for an offering in any way. God specifically singles out that an ass as far as it had to be redeemed. It was not an acceptable offering to God. So this really changes the dynamics completely as far as how horses and equines were used. Now, it's interesting too, I speculate and I suggest that perhaps Israel's influence on the region was like a shot that rang around the world, where perhaps Israel may have influenced the way the rest of the world treated the equines as far as their ritual use of them. So now the next question, and again, I'm going to reiterate again, we are going to go over tonight. I really didn't want to divide this lesson up, and I wanted to keep all the information together. So maybe just watch it in parts. So we'll probably have about another 15 minutes tonight. So one of the questions when you look at an early Exodus date, one of the questions that always comes up is, where is the evidence for Israel? Where is the archaeological evidence that shows that basically Israel was here? So what you find is that some of the blessings that God gave to Israel meant that there would not be a lot of archaeological evidence for Israel's existence within the land of Canaan. In Deuteronomy 19:1, God states that the houses and the cities that already existed, that Israel would simply reappropriate them. They would use those as their own. So if you're just recommissioning those places, you're not going to have a huge change if you're just making improvements. Perhaps it was destroyed and then you make improvements. In particular, both Hatzor and Megiddo show this type of occupation where there was destruction at the 1550 gap, but it was rebuilt and it was recommissioned and reused at this point in time. So it was not abandoned. In Joshua 24:13, it's reiterated again. I have given you a land for which you did not labor and cities which you did not build, and you will dwell in them. So if Israel is just simply not necessarily refortifying, but if they are making improvements so that they can live in these cities, you're not going to have a gap in those cities, but you're also not going to have anything that is Israelite per se if they are using the furniture, some of the pottery that had already been in previous use. The other thing that we're going to touch on tonight is this idea of God sending hornets before Israel. And when it comes to the discussion of how Israel conquered Canaan, I think that this is a very important discussion because we tend to look at it through a very myopic lens, where we think that the conquering of Canaan was simply done only by the Israelites. In truth, there was probably at least 3 different forces. You probably had primarily Israel. You probably had Egypt a little bit in the south under Mose, clearing out and conquering some of that territory. But in the north, we're going to find out that there was another force in the north that helped both protect and secure the land for Israel. So this is the promise that God gives at Mount Sinai to Israel as far as driving out the people from before Israel. And this is Exodus 23, verses 28. It states, "And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, the Hittite from before you. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out before you until you are increased and inherit the land." So the concept that you find here is that as Israel's population increases, then the more people they have, the better equipped they are to possess, control, and occupy the land. So this idea of a once and for all, one-time conquest is not necessarily the scenario that is supported by the biblical text. You find that the biblical text that Israel, from the point that they entered the promised land even until the era of King David, you find that they were really not a settled people. They were really kind of kept to a nomad lifestyle that they had had while they had been in the wilderness and wandered for 40 years. I have two texts here. I'm not going to read them, but both in the time of Deborah as well as late as David, we find that Israel was still living in tents. Now, it is possible that by the time we come to the monarchy, that the phrase, to your tents, could have been also included stone structures such as permanent dwellings of housing. That is possible, but you find in many cases that it refers to an actual tent which could be picked up and moved, especially for shepherds. You find both Isaiah and Jeremiah refer to a shepherding lifestyle among a large portion of Israel's population. So this would have been, Israel would have been unsettled. They would have been nomadic. And a nomadic people, even within their own land, even though it was given to them by God, they still would not have left a lot of evidence that could be excavated archaeologically. So when we're looking for evidence of Israel, if they're still living in tents, we're not going to have a city that stands out and says, this was an Israelite city, or anything that is particular Israelite, simply because you would have had pottery, you would have had things strewn on the ground that are typically covered up by sand, by time, and it's very difficult to find the places where Israel would have encamped. So that is another obstacle to finding evidence for ancient Israel during the early conquest period. Now, 40 years after Sinai, God reiterates this idea that he is going to send hornets before Israel to conquer the land. I'm going to take a quick drink and we'll read this. So God says, I will send the hornet among them until they that are left hide themselves from you and are destroyed. You shall not be afraid of them, for I am YHWH your God, is among you, a mighty and terrible God. And YHWH your God will put out those nations before you, little by little. You may not consume them all at once, lest the beasts of the field be increased above you. But YHWH your God shall deliver them to you, and shall destroy them with a mighty destruction until they be destroyed. And he shall deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall destroy their name out from under heaven. There shall no man be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. So again, you see this idea of not a one-time, one-generation destruction of Canaan, but a little by little as Israel increases in size and in number. So this is a kind of a paradigm shift when you think of conquest within the land of Canaan. Now you find that God actually has a whole hornet's nest at his disposal. And this idea of using the analogy of insects to depict foreign armies is something that is continued in Isaiah. And when Isaiah talks about the political situation right around the time of King Hezekiah, this is what Isaiah says. He says, YHWH will bring upon you and your people and on your father's house days that have not come from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So Isaiah establishes that he is talking about the king of Assyria. It says, and it shall come to pass in that day that YHWH shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt. So that would be in the delta region of Egypt. It says, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. So what is God talking about here? He's talking about the king of Egypt and the king of Assyria coming upon the land of Judah. Now we know at this point in time that Ahaz was looking at a confederacy with Egypt, and that Syria was the enemy. Excuse me. Assyria was the enemy knocking at the door and threatening both Egypt and the Levant. So Ahaz and later Hezekiah had confederated with Egypt. Eventually Hezekiah breaks off that confederacy and stands alone. But the key here is the analogy of flies, bees, and hornets that are used to depict foreign armies, foreign kings, and foreign nations. This is really something that is consistent throughout the Tanakh with how you see God referring to these types of insects. So a conquest Israel did not fight. This is how I titled this slide, because there is this idea that in Joshua 24, where God says, I sent the hornet before you and drove them out, even the two kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword or with your bow. So the idea is, remember, we saw the two Amorite kings that Israel conquered, both Og and Shihon, the two kings of the Amorites. But these were not just driven out by the Israelites. The Israelites actually had help. There was another force who had vested interest in Canaan, and that went before Israel and really weakened the territory, weakened the region. So the question is, who is that? Well, you find that the Hittites, right around this point in time, began a campaign where they began incursions into Syria. We do not know how deep they came into the territory. This is a relief of King Hattusilus the first making libations to the weather god, the Hittite weather god. What you find around this time period is that the Hittite kingdom had expanded, and it really expanded into Syria and Lebanon on the north. This this invasion and this conquest of the northern territory allowed Mitanni, the Hurrians, to come in and to establish shop. It also kept at bay the Assyrians. Oh, excuse me. So what you find with this is that the Hittites really provide a protective boundary that the Assyrians then cannot come into the land of Canaan, and they cannot attack Israel. But how far they came into Canaan and whether or not they would have attacked parts of the Amorite territory, we don't know. It is a possibility. We do know that they were challenging Egypt for control of Canaan at this point in time, and eventually Tutmosis has a battle that secures the border and prevents the Hittites right around 14, I believe it's right around 1430, from coming into Canaan any further. But what this does is this provides a protective bubble for Israel. And I'm just going to go ahead and read the effect of the Hittites warring in the north. It says, the Hittites' conquest of Elaka left a vacuum north of Syria near the Euphrates River, into which the Hurrians migrated. They established the Mitannian kingdom, which isolated and protect Canaan from the east, northwestern, and northern threats. So this is the ancient world, right around the time of Israel's conquest. And Canaan right now, at this point in time, is really considered an Egyptian dependency. Even though Israel has come in, they have conquered their land, even though there is vast destruction, there is enough of Canaanites that still exist for Egypt to exert control. What we will see in the upcoming chapters is that every time Israel rebels, Egypt comes in to exert control over this territory. So when Israel's obedient, guess what? Egyptians' power wanes. But when she disobeys and is what, as Judges says, you know, they did that which was not right in the sight of YHWH, that all of a sudden the Egyptians come in and they exert their power over this territory. The Hittites are still in the north. They are providing this protective boundary that prevents the Assyrians or the Babylonians or any of these eastern nations from coming into Canaan. Now, I want to draw your attention right here. See where it says Kassite Babylon, the Kassite kingdom. Take note of Babylon over here in the east, because in 2 weeks when we have class again, we're going to find that Babylon plays a very important part in Israel's history during the Judges era. So this does conclude our coverage of this section of the book tonight. We got all the way through page 528, and what we're going to look at in 2 weeks. Now, I want to point out there is no class next week. I am out of town. So in 2 weeks, we will have class again. And these are some of the questions we're going to look at. Was the conquest a single or ongoing event? What does Kassite Babylon have to do with Judges 3? And what about Egypt's control over Canaan? Because when you talk about an earlier Exodus and conquest date, the number one criticism that you usually find is the fact that the book of Joshua and Judges do not mention Egypt at all. So if there is no reference to the nation of Egypt having control over Canaan at the point in time when Israel is in Canaan, then that seems to provide a contradiction, so it would seem, between both accounts. So the question is, how do we recognize the silence and reconcile the silence between both parties? We're going to discuss that next in 2 weeks. The other thing that we're going to look at, which is quite surprising, are how when the Egyptians under Tutmosis, which would have been 1450, 1420 BCE, when he comes into the land of Canaan very early in history, he encounters cities that bear strictly names associated directly with the patriarchs. It is, you have to really jump through hoops to rationalize cities that bear names to the tribes of Israel and say that they have no correspondence whatsoever with Israel's history or Israel's occupation of the land of Canaan in 1450 BCE. So we will discuss those issues next time. I thank you guys so much for joining me. Go ahead. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'm going to take this off of the share mode, and we're going to go back to just the regular class. So if you guys have any questions or comments, please just jump right in. Let's see if I can do this here. All right, there we are. I think we are back to the normal screen. There we are. So any questions or comments? I know there was a lot of information that we covered. I tried to give you guys some maps to put it all into perspective. And again, I enjoy spending this time with you all and your Shabbat evening. Tomorrow we will be at Roots of Faith. Ross is talking tomorrow, so I hope to see you guys there. And I will be going to Texas this next week and having a great time with my kids and visiting my family for that week. So any questions at all? I'm glad you're with us, both Deborah and Betty and Cindy and Stephen. So good. I'm glad y'all are enjoying the visuals. I'm hoping I can do that every week. I will say it does take quite a bit more time, but I think it's worth it because when you see how it lines up, it makes it come alive. So, well, thank you guys. Any questions at all? Anything that's murky or left hanging in any way? And thank you so much for the feedback on the maps, Cindy. I appreciate that. So yeah, you know, this is the fun part. It's one thing to read about it in a book, but when you can see it for yourself, to me, that's when it comes alive, and that's when it has a great context. So, all right, well, no questions. Then we will see you all tomorrow morning. And again, no class next week. We'll see you in 2 weeks on July 8th. Shabbat Shalom.